The elderly woman sat quietly in her prison cell, awaiting her fate on death row. Her silver hair was always tidy, and her hands were gently clasped together as if in prayer. To anyone visiting, she appeared to be the picture of a sweet grandmother, the type who might bake treats for the local church or knit warm blankets for her grandchildren. But behind this gentle exterior was Velma Barfield, a woman responsible for the deaths of at least 6 people, possibly even more. She had poisoned her victims slowly, watching as they suffered, sometimes even comforting them as they slipped away. For years, Velma moved from one small town in North Carolina to another, offering care to the sick and elderly, gaining their trust, and then ending their lives. The media would eventually dub her the death row granny, but to those she killed, she was the person they trusted most. This is a story where kindness was just a mask for something much darker. If you're interested in true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. Velma Bullard was born on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, North Carolina, not far from Fayetteville. Her childhood was marked by hardship and fear. Her father was a violent man who abused his family, and her mother never intervened to protect the children. The constant threat of violence filled their home with dread. Velma learned early on that home was not a safe place. She witnessed her father's anger tearing the family apart, and she saw how powerless her mother was to stop it. These experiences shaped Velma's understanding of relationships and power. In her world, violence was normal and fear was always present. At school, Velma was quiet and kept to herself. She carried the burden of her family's secrets, and teachers noticed that she seemed older than her classmates. The trauma she experienced at home had aged her beyond her years. While other children played and laughed, Velma's innocence had been stolen from her. She often dreamed of escaping her father's house, believing that marriage was her only way out. Any man, she thought, would be better than staying in that environment. Velma became skilled at hiding her true emotions, learning to put on a mask for the world. This ability to present a false front would later serve her deadly intentions. When she was 17, Velma married Thomas Burke in 1949. He seemed to offer her a way out of her abusive home, and for a time, her life improved. They had 2 children together and, at first, appeared to be a happy family. Velma finally had the stability she had always longed for. Thomas provided a sense of security she had never known. Their early years together were peaceful, and Velma devoted herself to being a mother. She seemed to have found her place in life. But everything changed after Velma underwent a hysterectomy. The surgery left her with chronic back pain, making even simple tasks difficult. Doctors prescribed her strong painkillers, which helped with the pain, but also led to a dangerous addiction. The medication began to change Velma's personality. She became reliant on the pills just to get through the day. The drugs made her moody and unpredictable, and her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would swing between deep depression and sudden agitation. Her family noticed these troubling changes. Around the same time, Thomas began drinking heavily. The once happy marriage devolved into constant arguments, with both spouses struggling with their own addictions. Velma's dependency on prescription drugs made her difficult to live with, and Thomas used alcohol to escape the growing tension at home. Neither of them knew how to break the cycle, and their children watched as their parents' relationship deteriorated. The home became toxic and unstable. By 1969, the marriage was in ruins. The combination of drinking and drug use had destroyed any happiness they once had. Violence returned to Velma's life, this time in her own home. Thomas would come home drunk and angry, lashing out at Velma and the children. The same cycle of abuse that Velma had tried to escape was repeating itself. On April 4, 1969, Thomas had been drinking heavily and passed out at home. That evening, Velma did something unusual. She took the children and left the house, leaving Thomas alone. When they returned several hours later, they found the house completely destroyed by fire. Thomas had died in the blaze. The fire department quickly ruled it an accident, blaming a cigarette left burning. That was the official story, but some details didn't quite fit. The fire had burned unusually hot and fast, and Thomas had been too drunk to escape. Velma told investigators she was heartbroken, playing the role of the grieving widow perfectly. But those close to her noticed that she didn't seem as devastated as one might expect. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. Some wondered if the fire had been her way out. Her children were too young to understand what had really happened, and they accepted their mother's explanation. But as they grew older, they would begin to question the events of that night. In 1970, Velma remarried. Her new husband, Jennings Barfield, was a kind widower who seemed to genuinely care for her. The community thought they were a good match. Jennings was everything Thomas had not been: sober, responsible, and gentle with Velma's children. He brought stability and affection into their lives. For less than a year they lived together as husband and wife, and Velma seemed happier than she had been in years. The children began to trust their new stepfather, but in early 1971, Jennings suddenly became ill. He complained of heart problems and other mysterious symptoms that came on quickly and worsened over time. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. His tests were either inconclusive or normal. Throughout his illness, Velma played the role of the devoted wife. She took him to doctor's appointments, stayed by his side, prepared his meals, and gave him his medications. She seemed genuinely concerned, and neighbors praised her dedication. But despite all the care, Jennings continued to get worse. On March 22, 1971, he died from what doctors believed were heart complications. The death certificate listed natural causes, but years later, investigators would uncover the truth. In 1974, Velma's mother, Lillian Bullard, became violently ill while visiting Velma's home. She suffered from severe diarrhea, vomiting, and nausea, symptoms that appeared suddenly. Lillian had been healthy when she arrived, but the illness struck without warning. After several days of misery, she recovered, and the family was relieved. They had no idea that Lillian had actually been poisoned. Velma appeared to be a caring daughter, nursing her mother through the worst of it. Later that year, during a Christmas visit, Lillian became sick again. This time the symptoms were even more severe, and she couldn't keep anything down. She grew weak and dehydrated, and after being hospitalized, she died on December 30th, 1974. Doctors couldn't explain the cause of her illness and assumed it was a stomach virus. The family was devastated, especially since the death happened right after Christmas. Velma once again played the role of the grieving daughter, but she would later admit to poisoning her own mother. In 1975, Velma was convicted of writing bad checks. She had been forging signatures to get money for her growing drug habit. Her addiction to prescription medication was expensive and all-consuming. The court sentenced her to 6 months in prison, hoping it would be a wake-up call. She served only 3 months before being released early. Instead of changing her ways, Velma became even more careful. Prison had taught her how to cover her tracks better, and she became more methodical in her actions. During this period, Velma found her true calling as a caregiver. Families trusted her completely with their elderly relatives. She seemed so gentle and devoted, with her grandmotherly appearance making her seem harmless. No one suspected the darkness beneath her kind exterior. What these families didn't realize was that they were inviting danger into their homes. Velma had discovered that people rarely questioned the deaths of elderly individuals. She had found the perfect cover for murder. Caregiving gave her access to vulnerable people and provided a legitimate reason for their deaths. After her release from prison, Velma began working for an elderly couple named Montgomery and Dolly Edwards in Lumberton. The family believed Velma was the perfect person to care for their aging relatives. It wasn't long before Montgomery Edwards fell ill. He developed the same troubling symptoms that Velma's previous victims had suffered: stomach pain, weakness, and a rapid decline in health. On January 29, 1977, Montgomery died. His family was heartbroken, but they didn't suspect anything sinister. He had been sick for weeks, after all. Just over a month later, Dolly Edwards also became ill. She experienced the same symptoms as her husband, and the family was devastated to lose both parents in such a short time. Dolly died on March 1, 1977, 2 deaths in the same household within weeks, but still, no one suspected foul play. Velma had been present for both deaths, preparing their meals and caring for them during their illnesses. The family trusted her completely. Later in 1977, Velma took another job as a caregiver, this time for a woman named Record Lee who had broken her leg. The position seemed ideal for Velma's skills, but it was Record's husband, John Henry Lee, who soon caught Velma's attention. John Henry was a man of means and property, and he began to ask questions about Velma's background. Not long after, John Henry started experiencing severe stomach and chest pains, along with violent vomiting and diarrhea. The symptoms were identical to those that had killed Velma's other victims. On June 4, 1977, John Henry Lee died. His family mourned his sudden loss, never suspecting that their trusted caregiver was responsible. Velma would later confess to poisoning John Henry with arsenic. He had become suspicious of her, and she couldn't risk being exposed. Velma's next victim was Roland Stewart Taylor, her boyfriend and a relative of Dolly Edwards. Stewart was a kind man who cared deeply for Velma, but he made a fatal mistake. He discovered that Velma had been forging checks on his account to fund her prescription drug addiction. When Stewart confronted her about the stolen money, Velma realized she was in trouble. He could expose her crimes and send her to prison. She couldn't let that happen. Velma carefully mixed arsenic-based rat poison into Stewart's beer and tea, making sure he wouldn't notice anything unusual. Then she waited for the poison to take effect. In early February 1978, Stewart Taylor became violently ill, suffering the same symptoms as Velma's other victims: severe stomach pain, vomiting, and weakness. Velma played the role of the concerned girlfriend, rushing Stewart to the hospital and staying by his side as his condition worsened. On February 3, 1978, Stewart Taylor died. Velma told everyone she had done her best to care for him, but an autopsy revealed arsenic in his system. This time, Stewart's death did not go unnoticed. Unlike Velma's previous victims, Stewart was relatively young and healthy, so his sudden illness and death seemed suspicious. The hospital contacted the local sheriff's office, and deputies began investigating. They interviewed Velma and others who had been around Stewart in his final days. As detectives dug deeper, they noticed a disturbing pattern. Multiple people had died while under Velma's care, all with similar symptoms and circumstances. On May 13, 1978, Velma Barfield was arrested for murder. She was 55 years old and had been killing for years. The news shocked the small community. Neighbors couldn't believe that the quiet, grandmotherly woman they knew was capable of such crimes. She had always seemed so normal and caring. How could someone like her be a killer? At first, Velma denied all the charges. She claimed Stewart had died of natural causes and suggested that someone else must have poisoned him. But detectives had evidence. Velma had purchased rat poison shortly before Stewart's death and had access to his food and drinks. Under pressure, her story began to unravel. She changed her version of events several times and contradicted herself repeatedly. Eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence, Velma confessed to murder. Over the following weeks, detectives built cases for the other deaths. They exhumed Jennings Barfield's body and found traces of arsenic. They investigated the deaths of her other victims, and the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple people had died from arsenic poisoning while Velma was caring for them. She had been present for each death. Faced with multiple murder charges, Velma eventually confessed to more killings. She admitted to poisoning her mother, Lillian Bullard, and confessed to murdering Dolly Edwards and John Henry Lee. Investigators suspected there were even more victims. Her first husband, Thomas Burke, had died under suspicious circumstances, and the pattern of deaths around Velma stretched back for years. The true number of her victims might never be known. Velma Barfield's trial began in November 1978. The prosecution sought the death penalty for the murder of Stewart Taylor. It was one of the first times North Carolina had pursued capital punishment for a woman, and the case attracted national attention. Reporters from across the country came to cover the trial, and the death row granny made headlines everywhere. Prosecutor Joe Freeman Britt portrayed Velma as a cold-blooded killer, showing the jury evidence of her careful planning and calculated cruelty. The defense took a different approach, painting Velma as a victim of her circumstances. They spoke about her abusive childhood and difficult marriages, arguing that her prescription drug addiction had impaired her judgment. Defense lawyers pleaded for her life, saying Velma was mentally ill and needed treatment, not execution. They emphasized her role as a mother and grandmother. The prosecution countered that Velma knew exactly what she was doing. She had planned each murder with precision and covered her tracks expertly. On November 2, 1978, the jury found Velma Barfield guilty of first-degree murder and of using poison to commit the crime. The penalty phase began immediately, and Velma was sentenced to death. She became the first woman on North Carolina's death row in decades. Velma was sent to Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she was placed in a section for escape-prone and mentally ill prisoners. There was no designated death row for women, so Velma was North Carolina's only female death row inmate. Her presence forced the state to reconsider how they housed condemned women. During her 6 years on death row, Velma underwent a dramatic transformation. She became a devout Christian and began ministering to other prisoners. Even the famous evangelist Billy Graham praised her prison ministry work. Velma's religious conversion became a central part of her appeals. Supporters argued that she had truly changed and deserved mercy. A psychiatrist testified that Velma suffered from dissociative identity disorder, claiming she had an alternate personality named Billy. who had committed the murders as a result of childhood trauma and abuse. But the judge was not convinced by this explanation. He famously remarked, "One of them did it. I don't care which one." When Velma's final appeal was denied in federal court, she made a surprising decision. She told her lawyers to stop fighting for her life. She didn't want to pursue any more appeals to the Supreme Court. Velma said she wanted to face her fate with dignity and accepted her execution. This decision shocked many of her supporters who had hoped she would continue to fight for her life. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection. She was 52 years old and became the first woman executed in the United States since 1962. Before her death, Velma released a statement apologizing to the families of her victims. She said, "I know that everybody has gone through pain. All the families connected, and I am sorry." For her last meal, she chose cheese doodles and Coca-Cola, simple choices that seemed to reflect her ordinary grandmotherly appearance. Velma had also requested that her organs be donated for transplant, but after her execution, only her corneas and some skin tissue could be used, as her heart could not be restarted. She was buried in a small rural cemetery in North Carolina, near the grave of her first husband, Thomas Burke. Over nearly a decade, Velma Barfield killed at least 6 people. She confessed to murdering her mother, Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, and Stuart Taylor. The exhumation of Jennings Barfield's body revealed arsenic, confirming he was also one of her victims. Velma's case changed the way people thought about female serial killers. She shattered the stereotype that only men could be cold-blooded predators. Her grandmotherly image had hidden a calculating murderer. The story of Velma Barfield also brought attention to the vulnerability of elderly people in the care of others. Families became more cautious about who they trusted to look after their loved ones. The investigation into Velma's crimes exposed flaws in how suspicious deaths were handled. Many deaths had been ruled natural without proper testing, and after her case, law enforcement improved their procedures for investigating unexplained deaths. The impact of Velma's crimes reached far beyond her victims. Singer-songwriter Jonathan Bird, the grandson of Jennings Barfield, later wrote a song called Velma about the murders, giving a personal perspective on the pain her actions caused his family. Velma Barfield's story remains one of the most shocking in American crime history. A grandmother who used her caring reputation as a cover for murder, poisoning those who trusted her most. She moved quietly through small North Carolina communities, welcomed into homes as a source of comfort and care. But for Velma, vulnerable people were opportunities for profit. She killed without remorse, covering her tracks with skill and using her addiction as an excuse for her actions. Over the years, Velma's addiction to prescription drugs had completely changed her. The woman who once seemed to be a loving mother and grandmother had become a cold, calculating killer. The transformation was slow but total. Her victims never suspected that the person caring for them was also the one ending their lives. Velma used the trust people placed in her to destroy them, one by one, with poison. Her case left many people wondering about justice. Was it right that Velma Barfield was executed? Did her religious conversion and remorse mean she deserved mercy? Or was the death penalty the only fitting punishment for her crimes? These questions linger, and Velma's story continues to fascinate and disturb those who hear it. What do you think about Velma Barfield's case? Was justice served with her execution? Share your thoughts in the comments below.